Hello. Hey, how you doing? Didn't expect a response. That's okay. Thank you all for being here. I'm Michael McGee, and I'm going to be introducing Ahmed Masood for this event. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you all that the festival bookseller, Charlie Burns Bookshop, have books on sale in the lobby, and you can purchase copies of Ahmed's books after the event and have them signed by the author himself, which of course I would strongly encourage you all to do. I'd also like to thank the principal funders of this festival, the Arts Council and the Galway City Council, and of course Galway Arts Centre, who have supported, presented and been involved with the development of Kirch Literary Festival for the last 40 years. The Kirch Lecture was once a staple of this festival. Some of the most celebrated writers on this island have featured, and the lecture itself has historically functioned as a centrepiece of the festival, one in which the public and the people of the city are invited to come along and listen to the most significant writers of their time, present their thoughts on a range of subjects, forcing us, the listeners, the attendees of this festival, to reflect, to contemplate, and to challenge our preconceptions about literature and its place in the world. I'm grateful then to Manuela Moser, the director of this wonderful festival, and to the organising committee for reconstituting the Kirch Lecture and for inviting Ahmed Masood, a Palestinian writer, one of the most significant of his generation, to headline this prestigious event. In an interview with Bomb magazine conducted on the 1st of October 2002, Mahmoud Darwish, widely regarded as the most celebrated Palestinian poet of his or any generation, spoke about an episode from his childhood when he was invited by the Israeli authorities to write and read a poem to celebrate Israel's Independence Day. He was 12 years old, and the poem he chose to read that afternoon was a reflection on the situation that Palestinians like him found themselves in, being forced to celebrate an occasion that commemorates what was, up until now, the beginning of the single biggest displacement of Palestinian people in recorded history. That, of course, is the catastrophe, or what is more commonly known as the Nakba. Of course, that poem ruffled a few feathers, and the next day, the military governor in charge of the town where Darwish was from called Darwish to his office and scolded him for having written it. As far as Darwish was concerned, what he wrote and read was what he felt to be the truth. The incident made him wonder. The strong and mighty state of Israel gets upset by a poem I wrote, he said. This must mean the poetry is a serious business. My deliberate act of writing the truth, as I deeply and honestly felt it, was a dangerous activity. If this episode in Darwish's life speaks to anything, it's the clear and unassailable fact that poetry, or indeed any means of artistic self-expression, represents an act of freedom, one that subjectivizes realms of experience that challenge the orthodoxy of colonial and authoritarian power. It's dangerous because it resists erasure. It stands in direct opposition to the oppressor's language and policies of dehumanization, and it imbues the poet, and by extension the literature, and the people and the society from which the literature emerges, with the very characteristics, the hopes and dreams and ambitions, the metaphysical wants and desires that make us human. You can't dehumanize a person who feels what you feel. You can't erase a person who exists, not while they have a platform to stand on, not while they can still be heard. It is therefore in the interest of the oppressor to stamp out and to silence, to deny that the people being oppressed are capable of making art, that they have the capacity to think, to reason, to articulate their humanity, or to challenge the literary and artistic conventions of their time. This is something that Palestinian literature has had to contend with for the best part of 100 to 200 years. Outside the Arab world, many of their greatest writers and artists have gone unnoticed and unheard of. And for the vast majority of people in the Western world, the only images and stories we have been presented with paint the Palestinian people either as helpless victims or demonic terrorists. There is no in-between, no suggestion that Palestinian life exists beyond this binary reality. Thinking again about Mahmoud Darwish reading his poem for the local authorities when he was 12, Literature became for him a site of resistance, not because he made it so, but because the structures of power tried to disavow him of it. It's an important distinction to make, and one that speaks to the conditions that have structured Palestinian literature since the Zionist colonial project started to take root. It also speaks to our own history as an island that was and continues to be shaped by its colonial past, an island whose literature emerged partly in opposition to that past, not as one homogeneous mode of articulation, reducible to one singular style or literary mode, but through an outburst of various and often conflicting experimentations and cultural exchanges. Ahmed himself is cognizant of that history. He wrote his PhD on Seamus Heaney and Mahmoud Darwish, and how their poetry influenced and interrogated the construction of cultural and national identities in Ireland and Palestine. During his PhD, he was involved in setting up the celebrated theatre company Al Zaytuna, the main aim of which was to introduce Western audiences to Palestinian culture through drama, dance, and music. The last production he wrote and directed with the company was Onto the Breach, a dance adaptation of Shakespeare's Henry V set in Palestine, which I'd love to see. In 2014, he was awarded with Arts Council grant to write and produce a play on the Syrian crisis entitled Wallah, or Loyalty, directed by Richard Shannon. And in 2015, he put on the first production of his acclaimed play, The Shroudmaker, which successfully toured all across Britain in theatres and cities including Plymouth, Manchester, Liverpool, and Nottingham. His debut novel, Vanished, The Mysterious Disappearance of Mustafa Oda, was published in 2015, and his second novel, Come What May, was published in 2022. As I said, they will be available, and please do buy them. This isn't the first time Ahmed has visited Ireland to read or to lecture at an event like this, and it certainly won't be his last. He's a tremendous writer and thinker, and getting to know him and his work during the past year or so has been one of the great privileges of my life. I hope you can all join me in welcoming Ahmed Massoud.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. I feel like Steve Jobs coming to on stage in here, but don't worry, we don't launch iPhones in Gaza. We launch other things, but it's not going to happen today. It's only words we're gonna launch in here. But it is such an honor, and I'm so pleased to be here. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. What an honor it is to be giving this court lecture this year, and now I know the pronunciation correctly. I understand that this is a relaunch of the lecture, so I hope that by the end of it you won't think what a terrible idea it was to relaunch it, or at least not 5 minutes in after I start speaking. But I am truly overwhelmed to be here, to be honest with you. I wanted to put a picture of me quite young in Gaza, but I decided not to, and you'll find out when I speak. But if you do ask young Ahmed Massoud, and 25 years ago, that at some point in the future you'd be in Galway delivering a lecture to such esteemed audiences, he'd probably respond, "You're fucking with me." In the same way, Israeli bullets fucked with me many times. Their checkpoints suffocated me. Their barbed wires scratched my skin. Their rockets blew up my friends while standing right next to me. Their drones killed my own brother. It's all metaphors and allegory, semantics and storytelling. It's narrative, it's a verse, a cry, a poem that we have been composing, most recently for about 76 years of Israeli occupation and 100 years of British colonialism. It's deconstructing and building at the same time. It is hope wrapped in pages and words. I grew up in the Gaza Strip, a place engulfing rubble and tragedies at the moment, cocooning 2 million people facing Israeli genocide. At the age of 9, I was working on a building site, then in a market selling cleaning products. I was really shit at it. Really, never looked clean enough or smelled rosy enough to convince customers that our products worked. And that's why I don't have the picture there. At 12, I worked in an Israeli settlements in Gaza, picking up flowers to export to Europe. Yes, Gaza was one of the biggest exporter of flowers to Europe. I hated fucking Valentine's Day and romantic stuff. And when I walked here and saw the roses, I was like, okay. You will never get roses if you go out on a date with me, but you will get stories. Stories of a childhood crouching down all day, using clippers to make Europeans feel more romantic. You can hear the shouting of the Israeli contractor over my shoulders as he shouted on me to hurry up. You might also hear my stomach grumbling with hunger, not just there, but also when I got home a few days later and found that we had no food at home, only my mother and my 8 other siblings waiting for me to give them money to go shopping. My dad was a freedom fighter. He wasn't around. The only thing that connected me to him was actually books. He bought me so many books. Every time, every single opportunity, he got books. Strange books sometimes. I read Karl Marx when I was 10 years old, Lenin, but most importantly, all the amazing Palestinian writers. And I got obsessed. I got truly obsessed with Palestinian literature and Palestinian books, not because they are Palestinian and I identified with them, but because they offered hope and a world that I could not see to me at all. I read Ghassan Kanafani and Emil Habibi, whom we'll talk about later on. I read them all in between school, work, late at night, as I laid in bed with no electricity, listening to Israeli drones hovering over my head. Those books offered hope and gave me lots of sumud, or resilience. I identified with the characters, even with the stupid ones, such as Saeed in Emil Habibi's The Secret Life of Saeed, the Peace Optimist, published in 1974. I was in awe of that wise fool who becomes a collaborator with the newly created State of Israel, informs them against his own people, and just doesn't try to resist at all. And even that stupid character was fascinating to me. I realized that he was just trying to survive, like I was. We both had no means in the face of Israeli military occupation, supported by global imperialism. I took trips to the beach. And I just want to explain this. And so Israeli families on the beach in Gaza, the Israeli settlements were, before 2005, before they withdrew, they were right on the beach. They were in Gaza, and there was just a thin line or barbed wire that separated us from them. So you could see the other side in there very easily. I went there to Khan Yunis and saw those Israeli settlements built illegally on our land. I saw kids on my age swimming with floats and little dinghies, things I had never seen before. Water pistols were like a shock to me. The only guns I had seen were real ones pointed at me. And every time I saw something like this, I went home in silence and I read more. I loved Ghassan Kanafani's novels and characters. The symbolism of Khaldun joining the resistance in the novel Returning to Haifa, published in 1969, was inspiring. And as I grew up a bit more, at the age of 15, I tried writing myself. I thought I could create that world myself. I don't need to read it just through books. I can imagine it myself. I sat down in my parents' bedroom and I wrote a play, my first play ever. My father came back. I hadn't seen him for about 2 months or so. And he opened the door, and I looked at him, and I was in the, you know what writers called, in the zone. I was in the zone, and I didn't acknowledge him at all. He slammed the door, like really upset. He looked very upset. And then a few minutes later, he returned with a cup of tea that he had made himself with mint and lots of sugar. Write more, he said. We need your words more than we need any bullet. As it turned out, the play was really shit. My teacher at school said to me that I should study more maths. It is more useful, he said. And this is why I'm here today, standing in front of you to tell you about my people and their literature and their amazing cultural production. My Palestinian people in Gaza are often known for Hamas rockets, but little about their literary genius. When the Palestinian poet Samih al-Qasim, born in 1939, visited Gaza in 2000, I was there at Al-Azhar University. He was overwhelmed with the warm welcome he received from all parts of the Gazan society. Al-Qasim started his reading with the remark, "I have never met people who go to a poetry reading at 9 a.m." This image of a packed lecture hall at 9 a.m. is often missed out of Gaza. Hardship and bleak pictures of violence often jump to people's minds when thinking of Gaza. However, the small strip has given birth to some of the best-known Palestinian poets and writers who, with their pen and paper, have built a unique Palestinian literature able to compete on the Arab world literary arena. And this is what we're discussing today. The development of Palestinian literature as a literary movement, as a unique literary movement, given that huge conflict and struggle that they've faced. But before I continue to tell you about Palestinian literature, I want to talk a little bit about Gaza, my city, and where my family currently are. Just a few things to explain in here. Sumud is the Arabic word for resilience, or actually not resilience, it's steadfastness. It's not a common word in English, but steadfastness or sumud is a very, very important word in the Palestinian narrative itself. Gaza, the word Gaza itself, or Gaza, it means a stab, to stab something. So Gaza is like a stitch, right? So a stitch, so when you stab something, this is Gaza. We call it Gaza, and it's called Ghazat Hashim. Hashim was the grandfather of Prophet Muhammad, and he used to go on trade between Mecca to the Levant and North Africa. And he used to rest most of the time in Gaza. So he used to go and stab his pole and flag where his kind of tribe were going with him on trade, and that was his rest. So people used to refer to that area next to him to say Ghazat Hashim, where Hashim basically stabbed his flag, and that's how it became known as Gaza. In Hebrew, Gaza has a different meaning. Go to Gaza, it means go to hell, basically. So very much an insult to say the word Gaza. In the most famous use of the word Gaza most recently was the saying from our previous leader, Yasser Arafat, who used to say, "اللي مش عاجبه يشرب من بحر غزة." If you don't like it, go to Gaza and drink the sea. And that's because Gaza has always been referred to and associated with defiance and resistance and resilience. And we'll talk more a little bit about that. Even if we go back in history, apparently, if it did happen, who knows, but when Moses crossed the Red Sea, went through the Sinai, got lost there for 40 years, they didn't have GPS in there at the time, they got to Gaza border by Rafah, and he said to his people, "Come on, let's go, get into Gaza." And they said to him, "اذهب أنت وربك فقاتلا إن فيها قوم جبارون." Go and your God and fight. There are mighty people over there. And that is why Palestinians or Gazans are often referred to as Sha'b al-Jabbarin, the mighty people, which is something you don't hear about either. And again, another sort of famous character who comes from there, from Gaza, is, of course, the person he said, "And here I am, eyeless in Gaza." Does anybody know who said that? Maybe not, okay. It is an interactive lecture, by the way. Feel free to shout loud. It is Samson. It's the story of Samson and Delilah. And it's when Delilah figured out the secret of his strength, and that was his hair. So she cut his hair, and the Philistines, arrested him, put him under a temple. But of course, after years of being imprisonment, and they blinded him, and of course, after years of imprisonment, his hair grew back. And what he did was, as the Philistines were celebrating a big feast, he brought in the temple and broke down everything and sacrificed himself to liberate his tribes. So that is the story of Samson and Delilah based in Gaza. The most famous thing perhaps is the word gauze, which comes from Gaza. I don't know if you know the word gauze, which is a type of material. Gaza was very famous of making this material. We use it very regularly, so the bandages that are used in hospitals is from that material, gauze. It was very, in medieval Europe, they were relying on Gaza as the main source of importing gauze because a lot of the royal families there, they wore those sort of veils that covered the face as well in there. So that's a little bit of background about Gaza. But my favorite is this. Does anybody know what that is? That top sort of statue in there. That is the lower jaw of the phoenix. This is the main statue in Gaza, because the official symbol in Gaza is the phoenix. And that's because Gaza will always be reborn from the ashes. Which is good news for now. The bad news is that it will always be destroyed so it can be reborn again. And this is today, and it's interesting how everything is actually destroyed around it apart from this symbol. Many hundreds and maybe thousands of years ago, there was a guy who went to invade Gaza. He heard a lot about Gaza, and he loved it so much he wanted to occupy it. He came from Greece. He launched a massive army, went all the way to Gaza, and besieged Gaza for months and months and months. And eventually, and he starved the people and all of these things, very much similar to what's happening right now. And eventually, he was successful in invading Gaza. And he got all the men killed and raped the women, got the children out, etc. But then one Gazan man who is typical of Gaza resisted and rose up to resist and pulled his bow and arrow and fired an arrow and scratched his face. So this king ordered the destruction of Gaza completely. So Gaza was razed to the ground. And he left Gaza and carried on walking through the Sinai, all the way on the Mediterranean, heading sort of west towards Libya, crossing through Egypt, and then suddenly he stops and he misses Gaza and he thinks, what have I done? I've destroyed the city that I loved so much. I wanted to invade and occupy for a long time. So he orders the rebuild of a city that looks exactly like Gaza, and that is now called Alexandria. So if you want to know what Gaza looked like, you can visit Alexandria, named after Alexander the Great, who destroyed Gaza before. Gaza has been destroyed 6 times in history, and this is the 7th time, which gives me hope that it will be rebuilt again soon. Perhaps the most important person who comes from Gaza is somebody called Al-Imam al-Shafi'i. He is one of the main philosophers and imams and scholars in Islam, because what happened was, obviously, Prophet Muhammad came, then he died, and then lots of people kind of researched and sort of tried to interpret the Quran because it's a little bit ambiguous. And then many years later, these scholars came to explain Islam to people as the Muslim empire sort of expanded. One of the main ones was Imam al-Shafi'i, and he was the coolest of them all. He was the easiest. Basically, he was saying, well, if it doesn't say it in the Quran, then probably it's not haram. So alcohol is not, covering faces is not, it shouldn't be, etc. And the reason I'm mentioning him is that because often Palestinians are mistaken with this idea of like we're all conservative, we're all sort of Hamas fighters, we're all barbaric, uncivilized, that we don't deserve a life. But actually, our society and the fabrics of our society are completely different from what they're saying. And that's the thing, because we are not able to get our voices across. The narrative is told by somebody else. Everyone is talking about us, but it's not us who are presenting our literature, our poetry, which is very, very, very well established. And this is the point I want to emphasize in here, that it's often that the spirit and aspiration and dreams of nations are difficult to read through those history books because they're often written by the victorious. But in order to understand a particular nation, in my opinion, one has to delve into more than just a historical or socio-political narrative, reflecting on the personal experience of this nation. Basically, literature is that alternative. It offers that different genre. It offers a different perspective, as you know, about the history and the society and what was going on. And for us, Palestinians and Palestinian writers, me included in here, is that we always feel like we have that responsibility to present the other narrative. We always have that duty, and often we don't choose it. Do I want to be a freedom fighter, resistance literature writer, or do I just want to write about sex and alcohol and all of these things like all other writers do? And this is a dilemma that has been sort of followed us for the last 100 years or so. Perhaps Michael talked about Mahmoud Darwish, and I really like this quote from him in here. He says in there, "I would say myself that Palestinians are not merciful to their men of letters. This is because of their faith in the effectiveness of literature, which has been to them a compensation to all humiliations when they lost everything." That's referring to 1948, the Nakba, except words. Literature then took strength from the people to create a relationship between them and the lost home. A Palestinian writer is often asked, "Are you a writer or a freedom fighter?" And that is something I always struggle with myself, in a sense. However, what I'm trying to argue here in my talk is that literature doesn't just offer an opportunity of resistance, it also offers an opportunity of sumud or resilience or coping mechanism in here. Because what happens often when we write as a Palestinian writer in here, I'm processing that slow violence that is practiced on us. I'm not talking about the 20,000 children that have been killed. I'm not talking about the number of how many people in general have been killed, about homes and all of these things. I'm talking about the dad that missed his daughter. I'm talking about the wife that hasn't seen her husband for a long time. I'm talking about that slow violence that is often not captured by the media or reports in general. But this is, for us as Palestinians, is a struggle in here. How do you balance between the two? And most of the time, actually, we are labeled as writers of resistance or the literature of resistance. And to the majority of it, it is correct. I choose to be a Palestinian writer. I made a conscious choice to write about Palestine and to write all my stories, all my work, all my books are set in Gaza. And that's a choice I made because I feel like there are so many stories to tell. And I want to take people there through my words and through my through that portal that I'm creating to others. You can't go to Gaza, but through my books and works, you can. I remember having dinner once with Abdulrazak Abu Gurna, the writer from Zanzibar, who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago. And he said to me, "Ahmed, you and I will never win anything at all." And I was like, "Why?" He's like, "Because we write about things that nobody cares about, you know? We care about it, but nobody else cares about that." And I was like, great. Well, that was then when I launched my first novel, Vanished. I was like, well, that is really helpful, you know, thank you. And then a few years later, he won the Nobel Prize. Because I feel the ability to insist on talking and presenting your stories is something really admirable. And I would like to continue to do that as much as possible. It is resistance, but also it's resilience for me in here. So that's the theme that I'm trying to talk about today. I want to just take a moment to explain or describe Palestinian literature throughout the 20th century. Because often when people think about Palestine, it's almost like there was nothing there. You know, 1948 happened, is the sort of virgin land idea, the land without people. we were all just like a few Arabs in some villages, often portrayed over Christmas with a sort of nativity scene, with some sheep and all of these things. That's all who we were. And I wanted, as part of kind of countering that narrative that I started with, is to actually try and explain that as much as possible and to try and sort of talk about what was happening before then. So it's important to mention that literature, or Palestinian literature, didn't take its national and regional character in the 20th century until sort of the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. Before that, it was subsumed within the Ottoman Empire. And that's sort of thing that it's a political system. The Ottoman Empire is a political system that not a lot of people understand or relate to, because the way it was structured with sort of regional, federal, local governance. So there was always the governorate of Palestine. There was always the governorate of Syria. There was the governor of Palestine, the governor of Syria. So in a sense, they were independent states, but all related to the Ottoman Empire. I want to say like the Commonwealth, or a kind of example, or even like the UK, to be honest with you. However, the power was more centralized within Istanbul and the Ottoman Empire a lot more than it is in this UK or British political system or Commonwealth, etc. Before the 20th century and the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, most Palestinian writers, literary figures, like Arab writers as well, they were really kind of completely overwhelmed by the whole sort of Ottoman Empire in a sense, because the Ottoman Sultan at the time, they banned any artistic production throughout the Arab world. And in fact, if you were an artist, you were invited to go to Istanbul, to stay there, create art, often to praise the Sultan. Often it's art that is a bit like Shakespeare, I suppose. It's kind of like creating art that is about praising this Ottoman Empire, etc. And many Palestinian writers at that time joined them then. However, in the early 20th century, and with the breakup of the Ottoman Empire and the British occupation in 1917, 1918, after the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration, I don't know how many people here know about the Balfour Declaration, is when Britain, as an occupier of Palestine, and it's not mandate because nobody bloody gave them the mandate, they gave themselves the mandate and called it mandate. In its occupation, they actually invaded Palestine with 100,000 soldiers at the time. And which is more than they used to invade Afghanistan and Iraq combined, and many other corners of the world when they were just chopping up the world the way they wanted to. In 1917, they invaded Palestine. In 1918, they gave the Balfour Declaration, which was a promise and a commitment to those Jewish communities in Europe in recognition to their service of helping in the First World War, that they will build a national home for Jews in Europe, in Palestine. They also said that without compromising the rights of existing communities there, but they don't refer to the commitment of building a political state or a political entity for Palestinians in there at all. 1918, that was the Balfour Declaration, all the way to 1948 when Israel was established. Britain has worked really hard to establish that, at the beginning, encouraging Jewish immigration from Europe, arresting Palestinian literary figures. Really, there were no schools built. Arabic in some areas was banned as well. So a lot of Palestinian writers were really affected by this. And in between 1925 and 1947, Palestinian literature and writers, they kind of took that mission out of their own accords, is to try and concentrate on building a national identity as much as possible. And this was kind of the reference to my PhD that Michael referred to about how Seamus Heaney and Mahmoud Darwish and other writers sort of like they had that purpose of building a national identity. What does it look like? What does it seem like? And they used poetry. Most writers used poetry. Even those who wrote novels and other forms, they used poetry because poetry was quite easy to transfer and to be told and retold verbally, etc. So between 1925 and 1947, Palestinian literature started to concentrate on nationalism and resistance, especially after the increase of the Jewish population in the region as a result of the Balfour Declaration. Poetry flourished in this period with the rise of new poets such as Ibrahim Touqan, Abdul Karim al-Karmi, Abu Salma, Abdul Rahim Mahmoud, and Fadwa Touqan. And I will talk about Fadwa Touqan in a minute. Those poets gained wide readership mainly because of their political involvement in the Palestinian cause. Their poetry managed to transform national preoccupations with politics into a description of everyday social life and personal experiences of individuals who, because of their new political changes, were not able to live freely on their own land. Such experience was voiced out in poetic images and metaphors, which still live to present day as a symbol of the struggle. Abdul Rahim Mahmoud's famous poem, The Martyr, 1936, is now almost a manifesto used by some political parties, especially Hamas. He says in one of his most famous poets, سأحمل روحي على راحتي وألقي بها في مهاوي الردى فإما حياة تسر الصديق وإما ممات يكيد العدا. I will carry my soul on my shoulder and toss it in the valleys of death. I am seeking a life that will make my friend happy or a death that will make my enemy angry. And I want to just look at that sort of period in there and give you this quote to kind of think about how you've only recently heard about the killing of Palestinian writers in Gaza, that sort of deliberate targeting of Palestinian writers. And you heard about it just only recently, maybe some of you, with the killing of my own friend, my dear friend, Rifat al-Arair, who was killed in December 23, and mostly really because of his writing and how outspoken he was. Somebody I will talk about later on a bit more. But this is, again, this is in the 60s, this quote from the defense minister, Moshe Dayan. Some of you may recognize him, the guy with the eye patch in there. And he said that only one poem of Fadwa Touqan is enough to create 10 Palestinian terrorists. So often we've been associated, like our writing is dangerous to them because it insists on our existence and our resilience and our building the national identity in itself. And Fadwa Touqan is, she was born in, no, that's not the right slide, sorry. She was born in 1923 and died in 2003, sorry. You can tell I don't have the dates in here, so I thought they were in the slides, but anyway. But she was one of the most influential poets and one of those who built the national identity of Palestinians through her poetry, because her poetry insisted on the land and the connection to the land, and that her national identity was so important to her. Perhaps one of her most important poetry collection is called The Knight and the Horseman, and one of the most important poem is called Enough for Me. It's a long poem, but I'm just going to read an extract from it. Enough for me to die on her earth, to be buried in her to melt. To be buried in her to melt and vanish into her soil, then sprout forth as a flower played with a child from my country. Then 1948 happened, right? And there was no Palestine anymore. That whole identity was completely lost. Israel was established. Palestinians, 800,000 Palestinians were deported, including my own grandfather, who owned lots of land and lots of farms, a beautiful old Jerusalem house. Had it not happened, I probably wouldn't be standing here today, probably rich somewhere on a farm making olive oil and maybe wine or something. And suddenly the whole national identity was broken completely. So those writers who tried to build it up to then, resisting British occupation, done their best to create something, and something was beginning to establish. Then that shock that came in and dispersed everything, which is very similar to what's happening right now in Gaza in a sense. In fact, what is happening in Gaza now is a lot worse because over 2 million people are facing genocide, so a lot more than people because the population has grown. Gaza is more closed and more, it's an open-air prison, whereas back then people could flee, including my own father. My own father fled, unfortunately, to Gaza, and we lived there ever since, and he lived in a refugee camp. But even then, writers stood up to resist the 1948 disaster and urged people to be strong in the face of their enemies. One of the most important poets of this period was actually somebody from Gaza, and his name is Mouin Bseiso, born in 1927 to 1984. And he, very much the same as Abd al-Rahim Mahmoud, who talked about carrying his soul and tossing it in the valleys of death, he's also like, his poetry he was one of the quickest ones to immediately resist and say, we need to stick together, we need to rebuild, we need to resist as much as possible. So I will read you an excerpt, which is from his poem, The Footsteps. He says, brother, if they should sharpen the sword on my neck, I would not kneel, even if their whips lashed. My blooded mouth, if dawn is so close to coming, I shall not retreat. I will rise from the land that feeds our furious storm. So despite the Nakba, most Palestinian refugees or otherwise pursued education, helped by the establishment of United Nations refugee schools. Most of those schools were in refugee camps, either in Palestine or other Arab countries. I myself went to one of them. Many students went to higher education, enrolling in Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian universities, as education was seen as the only way to counter that occupation. This is why Palestine, and especially Gaza, actually has the most PhDs per capita in the world. So this period witnessed a new revolution, not just in Palestine, but I'm talking about literary revolution here. It was more the kind of modernist literary movement that was kind of spreading across the Arab world. There was an Iraqi poet called Nazik al-Malaika who followed the European stream of consciousness in her writing, and a lot of poets at that time found that new stream of consciousness really incredible because it was able to express their thoughts without the restrictions of any specific movement or literary movement. Before that, I should have mentioned actually before that, the main kind of literary movement at the time was Romanticism. Because Arabic poetry is very well established. It's got structure. I don't know if you heard about al-Mu'allaqat, the 7 suspended poems that used to be put in Mecca and the walls of Kaaba, even pre-Islamic, and people would have poetry slams. They would go to the pilgrimage in Mecca, pre-Muhammad, pre-Islam, pre-everything, and have poetry slams in there. So poetry is very much in the DNA of Arabic literature. And then it continued to be like this, changed a little bit, went down during the Ottoman Empire. In the 20th century, the period I talked about a little bit where Palestinian writers tried to rebuild it, also used the romantic kind of mechanism of writing poetry. However, after the Nakba and that loss and that disaster, that romantic movement was a bit too restrictive. Perhaps the best description is a literary critic called Muhammad Mustafa Badawi. He said, Romanticism was thought too vague, too escapist, and too full of beauty and daydreams, too sugary and sentimental to express the social and political reality of the Arab world, which was growing increasingly harsh during and immediately after the Second World War. And while Europe was kind of engaged in their own literary movements, post-colonialism, and all of these things that were happening, they were ignoring other literary movements that were happening elsewhere. In the Arab world, this stream of consciousness became and transformed into something completely new. It then became known as Al-Hadatha. Al-Hadatha is basically it's very difficult to describe really or have a translation of it in English, but essentially it's writing in a modern way, freely, but also with a kind of focus where you have that theme running in there. So I don't know what the equivalent would that be. Not quite stream of consciousness, but an organized stream of consciousness, I suppose. Regulated capitalism or whatever it is. It was just sort of like, a framework that in order to write with Al-Hadatha, you have to write within these rules, but you're free to choose whatever structure and stanzas and metaphors or whatever you want to do. So in the beginning of the 60s, the situation was not any better for Palestinians as more promises for solving their problems faded as the Israelis were determined to establish their own strong army. While writers wanted to find a modern way of communicating with readers in the Arab world, they began to simplify the language and choose topics that people knew and related to. The loss of Palestine was the most popular theme, so a lot of people, poets and Palestinian poets and writers focused on that as much as possible, which meant everything else was just kind of brushed under the table as well. And I want to sort of move on to a quote from Ghassan Kanafani in here. This is when really that idea of the literature of resistance came, in a sense, because he was a thinker, a philosopher, an activist, based in Lebanon, born in 1936, wrote some of the most amazing novels ever. I would recommend returning to Haifa. It's about a couple in Palestine who were based in Haifa, and in 1948, when Israel was established and about 800,000 Palestinians were deported, a couple, the husband was outside, he's trying to get home from work, he gets caught of the sea of people, and he's pushed outside to the port, to the Haifa port. The wife hears about this on the radio, she steps outside of her house just like that, and then she's swooped with the other sort of masses of people, and she's also deported from Haifa. As they meet later in Lebanon, they remember their baby that they left at home. And about 15 or 18 years later, they visit. They get a permit from Israel to go and visit, and they go to that very same house. They find a Jewish woman from Poland who came and took their house. And they wait and wait until the end, and I'm going to spoil the novel for you, but it is worth reading because it's a beautiful novel. They wait, and then they ask her about the baby and what happened to the baby. And she says, he's about to come home. And as she made the tea, the son returns home, dressed in an Israeli military uniform. And the parents look at their own child, who's grown in different circumstances, and the father looks at the woman and says, but why didn't you tell him? And she said, I did, but he decided to fight for us. And the father says, well, I have another child now, and he's part of the resistance in South Lebanon. I hope that if he meets his brother, that he will shoot him. And the novel ends there. It is a difficult thing to imagine that a father would say that. But when Kanafani wrote that novel, he was not only talking about what is happening now, he's talking about the future in a sense. The idea of resistance for him is about the future. It's about building a dream, building a different and an alternative reality. And for him, politics and literature are very much connected. So this is the quote from him in one of the news. He was the editor of Al-Hadaf magazine in Lebanon. And he says, my political position springs from my being a novelist. Insofar as I am concerned, politics and the novel are an indivisible case, and I can categorically state that I became politically committed because I am a novelist, not the opposite. So it kind of like he declared himself that writers should be that sort of political activists, they're sort of like carrying on with the national identity as much as possible. And in 1972, a car was bombed in Beirut. Mossad agents planted bombs in his car and killed Ghassan Kanafani with his children as well. And from that moment onwards, every single Palestinian writing became associated with the literature of resistance, that we have no choice but to be literature of resistance, because he set the bar high for us. People saw writers being killed back then and being in the forefront of the battle like other resistance movements happening, and thought that all Palestinian writers should be like this. And even I get asked a lot what my position on that, as I said. However, in my opinion, what differentiates Kanafani from other Palestinian writers is his progressive thinking, whereby his writing urges people to resist their circumstances and employ their capabilities to work towards a better future. This can only be obtained by continuously seeking new avenues to make life better for Palestinian refugees. In the years following the Nakba, most Palestinian refugees were shocked by what happened to them and were busy looking for their family members and establish connections with those who remained. Kanafani was one of the first to criticize that status and just basically saying to people, stop worrying about yourself, you need to resist, you need to build the future. And then, as I said, from that moment onwards, when he was killed, the term literature of resistance was coined. This is because Palestinians started seeing writers as freedom fighters and not just writers. Even Emil Habibi's work published in the 1970s were also labeled as literature of resistance. Even contemporary literature and the works of writers like Raja Shehadeh and Suzanne Abul Hawa and Salma Dabbagh and my own writing is often labeled as part of the literature of resistance. While I agree with this personally, and I don't have issue with this, yes, I am a freedom fighter myself. It's a just cause. I can say this in Ireland. I can't say this in the UK. I can edit it out, but so when you're doing the recording, edit it out, so just in case, please. I also think Palestinian literature and our writing has often helped our nation to survive through this, what we're facing at the moment. Like, it's just been one of the biggest genocides in history, and the worst part about it is the fact that it's being televised, to be honest with you. And you see everything. This genocide has made me a poet. I had never written poetry before, but when my brother was killed last year, I wrote a poem for him. And since then, I can't stop writing poetry. Might not be the best, but it's a way for me to cope. But in fact, many of my people, my siblings, they're reading it, they're sharing it, etc. So I'm hoping that I'm contributing to that. Our literature, books, and poems have been able to record that slow violence practiced on us, and they have allowed us to express our humanity differently. And that's why I prefer to refer to Palestinian literature as a literature of resilience or sumud rather than resistance. Despite the pressure on me personally to write political poems, I still write love poetry. I talk about sex and everything. Even my friend Rifat Al-Arghir, who I've had lengthy conversations on Gaza Beach with about how we need to reinvent the literature of resistance, is often labeled as a writer of resistance himself or a resistance poet. His refusal to leave his home in Shaja'iyya, which I sat in many times sipping tea and slagging off publishers, was indeed an act of resistance. He resisted, he wanted to stay home. But that does not make him a poet of resistance. But his poem, If I Must Die, which I'm sure you're all aware of, or some of you is aware of, is not a poem of resistance in my opinion. And I could imagine him, I could picture him when he wrote that. It is a poem of resilience or sumud, one that creates hope of continuity and the story, and that our story will be told differently. It offers possibility that our story will receive justice at some point. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you. I want to just skip this part because I was very upset when he was killed. Another mechanism Palestinian writers used to offer the context of resilience was actually humor. Perhaps one of the best examples about this is Suad Amiri's memoir, Sharon and My Mother-in-Law. And if you haven't read that book, I highly, highly recommend it. It's a memoir, an account of her life in the West Bank in Jerusalem, and how she had a dog who was Israeli dog, and she used to use her dog's passport to travel through the checkpoints between the West Bank and Gaza. It's absolutely brilliant. It's an incredible account. What a genius idea in there. And that irony that the dog can pass through an Israeli checkpoint, but she couldn't. Humor allows writers to discuss the cultural and social context openly in the disguise of jokes. I, myself, am a fan of this. Writers use this technique often to criticize not just the occupation, but everything around them, including their own community. I'm really a big fan of this form. If you Google Palestinian humor in literature, probably the first thing that you would see is my play, The Shroudmaker, which Michael referred to. I wrote this play in 2015, and it was based on a real character. I was late at night looking at the news, making sure that my family are safe, and I saw in the corner of this woman who had her shop open, and she makes shrouds for the dead. And the journalist was asking her, saying, look, how can you have your shop open? There's like a massive war happening in here. What are you thinking? And she was like, it's brilliant. The more people that die, the better for me. I make money, you know. So I started to imagine her life. And I went back to Gaza. I often go to, before the genocide, I go to Gaza at least once a year, often twice, because all my family are there. In fact, just before October the 7th, I was going to go there to buy a house and turn it into a theater. That didn't happen, unfortunately, but I'm hoping it will happen at some stage. I wrote the play, and I imagined her life, and it's all about how she's surviving through that sense of humor. And in fact, yeah, the play is there somewhere. And but then imagined her life and where she was and how she got there. Humor plays a big part in Palestinian culture, especially in Gaza. Isn't it that there is a saying here in Ireland that says that whenever life gets hard, comedy does very well? I don't know if you heard this, but certainly for us, that's the reality. Perhaps one of my worst work, not worst, but a play I wrote about this guy I met in Gaza, a young taxi driver who was on Tinder trying to find a date. And he did not give a shit about any political solution or whatever. The only thing that upset him was the fact that he was matching with Israeli girls across the border. And because that's how Tinder, if you have used Tinder, I used it for my own research. If you've used it, it was matching him through location. But of course, he once went to the Erez crossing, he changed his name to Zav instead of Zaid, and went to meet his date. It didn't work out well in the end. So humor offers another glimpse into the future and it's a way of coping. More modern writers, for example, I would recommend Mazen Maruf, who writes very, very incredible, touchy human work with a lot of humor. And the one book I would recommend is entitled, wait for this, The Rats That Licked the Ears of the Karate Champion. So just from the title, you can imagine what the content have. Another technique of offering resilience or sumud that Palestinians are using at the moment is to write more about the future and imagine Palestine post-liberation or post-apartheid or post-conflict. There's an anthology called the Palestine Plus 100, which brings together some of the best writing really there around that theme of what would Palestine look like in the future, and there is more and more happening within that. They offer a portal of hope, fear, and an imagined world where things can be different. Thinking about the future can be comforting. And in this note, I would like to end with this quote from Ghassan Kanafani. Oh, it's not here. I don't know what went wrong in there. No, it's here on the paper. I'm sorry. I would like to end with this quote from Ghassan Kanafani. And this is really important for you to try and kind of, I don't want to say understand, but to kind of really try and sort of think about why am I here? Why am I listening to this? Why is this important in my life? Why is Palestine important? Why is this genocide should be stopped? Why is Palestinian literature is important? Why is African literature is important? Why Sudanese literature is important, and all of these things. Ghassan Kanafani says, everything in this world can be robbed and stolen except one thing. This one thing is the love that emanates from a human being towards a solid commitment to a conviction or a cause. And before I go, I would like to invite you to come with me on a portal. I'm building it right now. It's almost finished, not quite there yet. I would like to take you on a journey with me to the future where the child Ahmad Masoud no longer works in an Israeli settlement, where a 13-year-old child doesn't spend 10 years in prison. And where we don't do anything about it. I'd like Ahmad Manasra, that's his name, who was released from prison yesterday after being arrested at the age of 13. I'd like him to come and speak here next year instead of me. I'd like you to come with me on this portal to a place in the future where our fiction doesn't have to be literature of resistance or resilience. You have a voice, it's a strong voice, it's influential. People want to listen to you. You can change things. Here in the audience, outside and elsewhere, you can make a difference. And whether you decide to stay silent or keep going, that's entirely up to you. Whether you want to join my revolution or my portal, that's also entirely up to you. But just remember that you made that choice. And remember the power of words and what they can do to change everything. And I want to finish with this poem I wrote, also called Words. And it's in response to somebody who said to me, I have no more words. And I hate that so much. I hate it. Because how could you not have more words? Words, letters, symbols. She says, there are no more words. I don't know what to say. These are all words. Tell me I am beautiful. Say it with your heart speaking, not your lips. Send me a postcard. Share my post, my pain, my story. Hope with me and lie to me. Paint a skyline on my prison cell. Let me choose the colors. Write my words in case I die. Turn them into stickers and put them on buses. Revolt, keep going, stop, cry, make love. Start again with the hope of the revolutionaries and dreams of young lovers. Say the words, free Palestine. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.